Well, hey guys, welcome to today's video. We're going to talk green giant propagation today, right here behind me. And probably going to have to do this video in two parts because it's going to get a little long. But that being said, I want to show you how to root these beautiful little trees that turn into huge trees. And another part of the reason why I love them so much is because they're easy to propagate. Now, you guys may remember that on a previous video from back in the summer this year that I bought in a ton of these, like 1,000 of them or whatever it was, and 1,500 of them, I think. And but we also propagate quite a few of them. I just don't have the ability or the resources at all to do 1,500 of them myself. So what I want to show you is how you can propagate 20 of them, or how you can propagate 100 of them, or even 500 of them, or something like that in a limited space like I have here in my backyard nursery. Because, you know, that's kind of the deal. It's always managing your space and figuring out how you can maximize your space, even if your space is small, and kind of how to get the most bang for your buck for square foot, and just really depending on how you want to set up your yard and your nursery. So I want to show you these green giants and how I'm going to propagate them, how I always propagate them, and how easy this is to be successful with this. So we're going to get down here on the ground where these are growing, and we'll start there. Now, these green giants here behind me, they are 35 to 40 inches tall, and I really don't like for them to get quite that tall. I just, you know, I don't want to be growing and selling big plants. I want to just be dealing with small ones, but these have grown so fast. They have, these particular plants over my shoulder here have been in the ground for 2 growing seasons now. So it's kind of like after 1 growing season, they weren't quite where I wanted them, but I left them in the ground another growing season. They're really too big and they've crowded each other. So we're going to be working with these some, and I've got other beds of them also that we'll be looking at and that we'll be working with. But what I'm going to do is I'm going to sacrifice some green giants today. And look, these green giants at this height, at this size, I really don't know what they would sell for. At least $9, $10, $15 each. I mean, these things are over 3 feet tall on average. But I'm going to shred them up, and I'm going to make more cuttings from them, at least from some of them. That's what you have to do with plants. So sometimes you can just prune a plant and use the cuttings out of that plant and wind up selling that same plant later, like I do with my hydrangeas. But with an evergreen like a green giant, at least the way I do it, it's going to be a little bit different than that. So I'm going to cut some of these off and begin to make some cuttings with them and show you what to do with those. Now, it may seem a little bit counterintuitive, and maybe it is, to come and take a tree like this. This is a green giant. This particular one is probably 30 inches tall right here on the front of the bed. But I'm going to take my clippers and just cut the thing off. Just like that. I killed it. So I'm going to cut off these other branches too. It had some branching around the bottom of it, and take them over to the table. And keep in mind, just as this stood here, I could have dug this out of the ground. It's dormant, bare root, wintertime. Dig this out of the ground, put it in a pot, probably a 1-gallon pot, maybe a 1.5-gallon pot, and sold this plant for $9, $12, something like that this spring. So just keep that in mind as we're working through the process of making these cuttings. Now I'm over here at my table where I do so many of my cuttings and potting and all sorts of things, and here's the little Arborvitae green giant that I just cut down. And just kind of for starters, one thing is some really guaranteed cuttings that you're just going to always have success with are these up here in the top. And you can kind of see the coloring here of this being all this season's growth. It's just real light brown, almost a tan color, versus, you know, previous seasons where it's darker. This season's growth cuttings are just going to be super, super easy to work with. Not just work with, but they're going to successfully root just virtually all of them. And you may have some that fail, but that's going to always be the case. But so what you want to do is you can just do this with your hands. You just take that cutting there and just rip it off. Just like that. And what I like to do is take my clippers and just cut that little tag off there and strip off these last couple of pieces of green. Just do a little trimming on the top, and there's you a really nice cutting. So I'm going to make a whole bunch of these, and I'll show you what to do with them. I'm just going to lay these here so you can see them, but most of these first cuttings, at least, I'm going to take out of the top of this. These are the new growth from this past growing season. It's late December now, and you know, something I'm curious about on this, what I would normally do is something like that, and that would be the cutting, that little tag down there, a little breezy out here, a little tag right there, and that be the cutting. But what I'm curious about today is I'm going to use some of this smaller material and do it the same way. Just trim off this bottom, maybe a little off the top, and let that be a cutting. And I'm going to kind of separate these into these larger ones and smaller ones. I'm going to put them in separate containers, and I'll show you that in a minute, and see if one of them tends to work better than the other. But here's another plant, or another cutting. We just tear that off with our hands and rip those bottoms off there with your hands. Put the excess off of the top. There's you a nice little cutting. And you just keep going on and on up the stem here. This is actually the top or the terminal leader there of the plant. You know, one of those would have been the tip top of the plant. So you just clip some of that out just so it's not so big. There's another one. Just clip some of that excess off of there. There you go. You got your little heel here on the bottom, tag, whatever you want to call that. And then we're just going to keep going on and on with these until we have finished making cuttings out of this first green giant. All right, I have finished doing the cuttings from the first tree here. Let's just see how many it is. 1, 2, 3, 4, 15, 16, 17, 18, and I got 3 small ones, 19, 20, 21. We'll just say 20. All right, so 20 plants to start off with, or 20 cuttings to start out here to stick for propagation through the next year. And all 20 of these cuttings are not going to root. Some of them will just fail, and I don't know exactly what percentage they will root at, but let's just say that half of them root. And these 20 cuttings turn into 10 plants. Well, we've sacrificed one, let's just say $10 plant for the possibility of having 20 or 10 $10 plants 2 years from now. So this is kind of how the math and kind of how plant propagation works. Sometimes you do sacrifice plants. Sometimes you don't have to sacrifice the plants. And you can take cuttings from green giants without destroying the whole plants. This is just the way that I'm doing it, and I've got so many of these, and I've got so many that are really kind of overgrown, and I'm not going to have room for them. So it's another way that you can do it. And I'm going to just keep making a bunch more of these cuttings, and I'm going to show you how to stick them and just kind of what that looks like. So I went and cut another one. This one's a little bit bigger. We're just going to do the same thing with it. I like to just cut it in half and make it a little bit smaller to work with in 2 pieces. But, you know, here's the thing. Growing plants, it's not usually referred to as this, but growing plants is farming. And whether you think of it as farming or not, it's farming, because here's the thing. If you're a smart cattle farmer, not even just smart, if you're a cattle farmer who's going to be in the cattle business for a lot of years, you know that you don't ever get rid of all of your mama cows. Those mama cows are going to keep producing calves year after year after year. And sometimes you keep some, and sometimes you sell some. But you have to keep your stock, and the plants are the same way. You know, some of these plants I plant out in my yard in my own landscape. Some of them I have grown in my nursery, and I just take cuttings from them year after year and keep the same plants. And you buy some in, you sell some. But what you want to make sure that you don't do is sell everything you got, or you're in trouble. If you sell everything you got, you're not ever going to have a source to make new baby plants from. So, you know, there's always a trade-off involved, and people who are smarter than me know the most efficient ways to do that and could give you a great deal more insight on that than I can. But what I do know is that some of these little plants get sacrificed in order to make a whole lot more plants down the road. So when you're doing this, it might be good to think of yourself as a farmer. You know, you're a propagation farmer, you're a backyard farmer, you're whatever you want to call it, however you want to think of it, but just realizing that something needs to always be growing, And there needs to always be a source for the next crop, whether it's by sacrificing some plants, or you know, you could just take a cutting off of a plant. Like, let's say this plant was still standing there growing, I could just come up to it and cut one of those off. Knock that behind the table, had to go get it. You can just cut one of those off of a standing growing plant and not have to kill the whole plant. And there you've got 2 cuttings off of it from one branch, and there you go. That tree would never know the difference, and it'd just keep growing right out in your yard or wherever it is. I'm gonna try to take a skinny cutting here off this one and see if some of these smaller cuttings will work. We'll just experiment with that a little bit. So we're gonna just keep going making cuttings, and we'll have a pile of them here pretty soon. Now I've got me a pile of cuttings here, about 50 of them, and I'm not even sure exactly. And I use dish pans. And look, this is Dollar General. God knows Dollar General stores are everywhere. Drill a few holes in the bottom of your dish pan so they will always drain well. And I'm going to mix sand in here, and it doesn't matter how much, just put you some sand in there. Look, this is the stuff on the side of the bag that says play sand. I don't even know what that means. You just need some sand. If you can find some sand that's got some little pebbles in it, maybe like a construction type sand or something like that, something they mix to making concrete, it's better just because it's going to drain better. So what I make mine drain really well with is this same pine bark I use for everything. So I'm going to just add a couple of good handfuls of pine bark into this sand mixture, and all I'm doing is creating a media here that will hold a little bit of moisture and that will drain really well. That's it. There's no nutrients, don't matter when you're trying to propagate, make any difference at all. And I'm just mixing sand and pine bark. You can do this in pure sand. It's fine to do it in pure sand. I've done a lot of it in pure sand. Here's the thing about doing it in pure sand: whatever containers you're using, you can use any kind of container. You can use, I mean, we've used old popcorn bowls for this and drilled holes in the bottom of it. You can use your containers that you grow plants in. You can frame up little boxes out of 2x lumber. I mean, it's anything that will hold your mixture. Anything that will hold your mixture and will drain. There's no magic in the sand and the pine bark. It's just what I use. You have to find what's available in your area. Again, it just has to drain well. You might even use your own potting soil mixture. I've propagated tons of things in my own potting soil mixture. Again, don't get obsessed over what kind of sand I use. Don't get obsessed over what kind of pine bark I use. It just needs to drain. I can't say that enough times. People think you have to use this exact thing. Listen, if you're in a more controlled environment, if you're commercially growing in greenhouses and growing hundreds of thousands and millions of plants a year, then yep, all that stuff matters. I'm a guy out here in my backyard hobbying around with plants. Don't worry about your mixture. It just has to drain. It has to drain. It has to drain. I cannot emphasize that point enough. So here I've kind of mixed this sand and pine bark up with my hands. You could use any number of things, but I've just mixed it up with my hands just to kind of get it stirred together. I'm going to take these cuttings and stick them in the sand, and well, I'll show you that. So I got my dish pan full of sand and pine bark here, and I just soaked it with the watering can just to settle all of that down in there. And I'm going to take a screwdriver and just poke holes in here. And I know that I've got about 50 cuttings here, so I need to kind of plan accordingly so they'll all fit. But you just take these cuttings, poke a hole in there, and then you just stick them down in the holes that you made. You can, instead of using a screwdriver or whatever you have, you could take something like a putty knife, drywall knife, whatever you call it, and just cut slits across there and just stick them down in those slits. And these really don't particularly need any amount of space between them. You're not trying to grow a bed of plants here. You're just trying to root cuttings. So you just stick them down in those holes that you made and go and make your next row. Probably need to tighten those up a little to make sure they all fit. And if you're doing a smaller plant that produces a smaller cutting, you can get close to 100 of them just in a dish pan. They don't need but a square inch of space or something like that just to have room to do their thing. So, but yeah, just one at a time, just put them down in there. And when you've finished doing this, all these cuttings, when you finish doing this, then I'll just soak them all in, and that'll be it. And then you take your watering can, water hose, whatever you got, and just soak them really good. You want all that, every one of those cuttings to be very well seated in there. And you don't want air pockets around your cuttings, and all, you can see water standing in the top of that, but it'll drain out of that very quickly with all those holes that are in the bottom. And then I'm going to take this and just sit it down over here in the shade, and I'm not going to do another thing to it. Now you can see the water pouring out of the bottom of that pretty good, but I'm going to sit these out here in my shade house, and I'm not going to do anything else to them. And I'm going to make more of these. I'm just doing this for the sake of a video today, but this is just going to sit here. It's late December. It's close to 70 degrees today. In 2 days it's supposed to be about 16 degrees. Winter hasn't even arrived yet. It's going to sit out here all winter and freeze and thaw and freeze and thaw, and it's going to be fine. I'm going to make sure if we go through any prolonged dry spells that I water it once every couple of weeks or something, just to keep the sand and the bark from drying out completely. Besides that, it's just going to sit here, and come springtime these things will begin to callus and they'll begin to root. You can do this anytime in the winter, from the time they go into dormancy when you've had your hard freeze all the way up until, you know, right before they start to grow out in March or whenever your spring starts in your area. But that's the end of part one. And in the next part, I'm going to show you what you can expect. And I'm going to take my cuttings that I did this exact same thing with last year. I'm going to show you what they look like now and show you how to deal with them. So hope this is helpful. Thank y'all for watching. Love all of you. Hope you're having a great day.